Government-run schools never seem to teach that states have the power to stop federal programs simply by refusing to implement or enforce them. James Madison gave us the blueprint for this during the ratification debates over the Constitution. And in what might be a surprise to many of you, the Supreme Court has actually agreed and repeatedly upheld this blueprint for over 180 years in something called the Anti-Commandeering doctrine. On this episode, I'm going to break down all the details and highlight the 5 major cases that support this powerful 10th Amendment tool to keep the federal government in check. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for August 9th, 2024. And let's kick this off with James Madison writing in Federalist number 46, where he gave us the strategy, his 4-step blueprint for how states and individuals can undermine and defeat federal programs without relying on the federal government to somehow magically do what it never does, which is limit its own power. And here's how he started. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which may sometimes be the case, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. So, as we can see here, what Madison is telling us is that you can stop, you can block, you can check federal power whether the federal act in question is constitutional or unconstitutional, warrantable or not. The strategy is exactly the same. And most prominently, he recommended a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's Madison's words, not mine. Now, this included noncompliance by individuals, by the people at large, and then also what he called state legislative devices to help effectuate this on the state level as well. Now, he also told us that this would be a very effective strategy, incredibly effective. He said it would oppose in any state difficulties not to be despised, would form in a large state very serious impediments. And he said where the sentiments of several adjoining states happened to be in unison, it would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. In short, a refusal to implement or enforce a federal program, a noncompliance by the people of the states in a single state would create some serious problems for the feds. Serious impediments is how he put it for a large state, a single large state. And a bunch of states, well, the feds are toast, absolutely toast. Mind you, this is in a time when the federal government was going to be absolutely tiny, minuscule in comparison to what we live under today, the largest government in history. So now it's even more effective than at the time when James Madison discussed it. Now, this strategy, I know they don't teach you about this in government-run schools either. It has been used a bunch, both deep into history and also currently here in modern times, probably more now than ever. And we cover this in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report, where we highlight many of the primary examples of this, both historically and currently. It's a free download at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. I urge you to get it and read through that. Now, setting all that aside, that founding era stuff aside for a moment, the practical reality that we live under today is kind of unfortunate. A vast majority of people, almost all of them, and I think this is still an understatement, they really believe falsely that the Constitution means what the Supreme Court tells us it means until they change their mind. So their view is unless the Supreme Court agrees, well, then to them, Madison's view means nothing. Oh, that's something that dude wrote. Who cares? The Supreme Court doesn't agree, but surprise, surprise. Now, this doesn't happen super often, but the Supreme Court does agree. And they have agreed many times, consistently. And I'm going to cover here a series of 5 major cases starting in 1842, going all the way to 2018. Here's how Mike Meharry described it. He said, the Supreme Court has long held that states do not have to actively participate in the enforcement or effectuation of federal acts or regulatory programs. And also, it doesn't matter if they are constitutional federal programs or not. The states, the sovereign states can just choose how they are going to use their own resources. If it's a federal program, the Fed's got to figure out how to implement it. That's the basic point here. James Madison's advice, Mike points out, for resisting federal overreach in Federalist number 46 serves as the basis for what we now know as the legal doctrine of anti-commandeering. The first case was in 1842, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. This is primarily dicta, but there Justice Joseph Story, Mike writes, held that the federal government could not force states to implement or carry out the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. He said it was a federal law, and therefore the federal government ultimately had to enforce it. And here's a quote from that. The fundamental principle applicable to all cases of this sort would seem to be that where the end is required, the means are given. And where the duty is enjoined, the ability to perform it is contemplated to exist on the part of the functionaries to whom it is entrusted. I mean, this is just legalese flair to, well, if you're the ones who are empowered to do something, then you're the ones who are supposed to be the ones doing it, not some other level of government. He said the clause is found in the national constitution and not national. Anyway, I'm going to set that aside. The national constitution and not in that of any state. It does not point out any state functionaries or any state action to carry its provisions into effect. The states cannot therefore be compelled to enforce them. That's Prigg versus Pennsylvania, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 case in 1842. Now, there are a few more cases in between, I think like 1911, 81, 82, some smaller ones that kind of lean on this as well. But the next major one, we have to fast forward all the way to 1992. In New York versus U.S., the court held that the regulations in the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Amendment Act of 1985 were coercive and violated the sovereignty of New York, holding that, quote, because the Act's take title provision offers the states a choice between the two unconstitutionally coercive alternatives, either accepting ownership of waste or regulating according to Congress's instructions, the provision lies outside Congress's enumerated powers and is inconsistent with the 10th Amendment. Now, Sandra Day O'Connor wrote for the majority. I think it was 6-3. And here's the primary holding. You can see it here on Justia. This will all be linked to in the show notes, so you can read through these cases if you want to, and Meharry's article and some of these original source documents. That'll be published as a blog post like we do for every episode, a couple of hours after the live stream is done at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But here it is on Justia. The first line, primary holding. The federal government cannot commandeer a state into enacting a certain law. I mean, that's narrow, but here's how Sandra Day O'Connor wrote for the majority. As an initial matter, Congress may not simply commandeer the legislative processes of the states by directly compelling them to enact and enforce a federal regulatory program. Now, she takes the position, just like all the other ones do, that the feds, whatever they broad power that the Supreme Court believes the federal government has far beyond the original legal meaning of the Constitution, they basically say, you guys can do all this stuff, but you can't force the states to do it. You can offer them a deal and maybe they can agree with that, but you can't force them to do it. And here she is again. She said the constitutional question is as old as the Constitution. It consists of discerning the proper division of authority between the federal government and the states. We conclude that while Congress has substantial power, of course they had that, substantial power under the Constitution to encourage the states to provide for the disposal of the radioactive waste generated within their borders, the Constitution does not confer upon Congress the ability simply to compel the states to do so. Yeah, just over and over and over. Now, here's Mike Meharry writing on the next case. Printz versus U.S. 1997, he says, is generally cited as the linchpin for the anti-commandeering doctrine. The majority was written by Justice Scalia, where he wrote in the majority, it is apparent that the Brady Act purports to direct state law enforcement officers to participate, albeit only temporarily, in the administration of a federally enacted regulatory scheme. They said, no way, you can't do this. This violates this anti-commandeering principle. He said the federal government may neither issue directives requiring the states to address particular problems, nor command the states' officers or those of their political subdivisions to administer or enforce a federal regulatory program. Political subdivisions are all those local governments, counties, cities, towns, etc., and all the law enforcement agencies. So those are political subdivisions of the state, and the federal government cannot commandeer them into enforcing or implementing federal acts or regulatory programs. That's Printz versus U.S. in 1997. Next up, the next major one is the independent business, NFIB versus Sebelius. This is the famous Obamacare case in 2012, which had a lot of problems, but here they got something right. There, the court held, Mike writes, that the federal government cannot compel states to expand Medicaid by threatening to withhold funding for those programs already in place. Justice Kennedy argued that allowing Congress to essentially punish states that refuse to go along violates constitutional separation of powers. And they write it like this: the legitimacy of Congress's exercise of the spending power thus rests on whether the state voluntarily and knowingly accepts the terms of the contract, in quotes. But basically it's saying, like, even with federal funding schemes, the feds can't just say, okay, if you guys don't want to participate in this, we're going to withhold all your funding for that. This was addressed in another case, South Dakota versus Dole, where they basically said, you can't go, there's some gray area. They can threaten some funding on unrelated areas, but it can only be a small percentage, a few percent of the overall budget. Otherwise, and if the states have not agreed to do something, they don't have to. You can't just throw cash at them and then all of a sudden they're required to do it, although they tend to voluntarily go along with it. But if they choose not to, they don't have to. And that's exactly what they're saying in NFIB versus Sebelius as well. Respecting this limitation going further is critical to ensuring that spending clause legislation does not undermine the status of the states as independent sovereigns in our federal system. It's not something you hear too often from the central government, so-called federal government. Next up, we have the last one. The most recent one is Murphy versus NCAA in 2018. And here, Meharry points, this was about a state removing prohibitions on some sports gambling in New Jersey, which a federal law, PAPS, I believe is how it's pronounced, was saying was illegal to do. And here the court held that Congress can't take any action that, quote, dictates what a state legislature may and may not do. And writing for the majority, Samuel Alito put it like this: a more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. Man, that is not messing around at all. And here's how it goes a little further, how Alito put it. He said, the anti-commandeering doctrine may sound arcane, but it is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution, i.e., the decision to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. It was specifically decided that they were, even though there were many people who wanted that version early on in the Philadelphia Convention, that's not what was passed. That's not what was sent to the people of the several states, the ratifying conventions. And so they never considered any proposal to have a general government or a federal government that could give orders to the states. And in fact, I'll get to it in a moment, one of the first chief justices actually reiterated that. But here we are back to that 2018 case, Murphy versus NCAA. The legislative powers granted to Congress are sizable, but they are not unlimited. The Constitution confers on Congress not plenary legislative power, but only certain enumerated powers. So the Constitution delegates to Congress certain delegated enumerated powers. Everything else is reserved to the people of the several states. That's exactly how James Madison described it in Federalist 45, how Tench Coxe and others described it as well. But going further, therefore, all other legislative power is reserved for the states, as the 10th Amendment confirms. And conspicuously absent from the list of powers given to Congress is the power to issue direct orders to the governments of the states. The anti-commandeering doctrine simply represents the recognition of this limit on congressional authority. And I mentioned the third Chief Justice. This was Oliver Ellsworth. During the ratification debates, he explained to the people, in Connecticut at least, hey, if you're concerned about how this system is set up specifically, this is not going to be a central government, bossing around the states. That's not what we're setting up here. He said this Constitution does not attempt to coerce sovereign bodies, states, in their political capacity. Now, one additional point that I think is very interesting is that Alexander Hamilton and the other big government types at the time of the founding, they did not want this kind of system where the central or the general government had to rely on states to implement their programs. In fact, they complained about that. Was one of the things that they hated about the Articles of Confederation was that it was a government that had to get basically approval, action by the states to do the stuff that they want. They wanted a central authority, much more powerful than what they gave us, but some of them wanted a very strong government that would act only on individuals. And if you had to rely on states, Alexander Hamilton, writing in Federalist number 16, was saying, this is a problem. Now, of course, he's complaining about it. But for us, we're recognizing as support of the anti-commandeering doctrine's effectiveness that, here, I'll leave it to Hamilton's words. He said, if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. So today, even though the Constitution was designed specifically to avoid having to rely on states to implement federal acts or regulatory programs, the federal government is so massive, the largest government in history, that the National Governors Association a number of years ago has been very clear that, quote, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And here's the dirty little secret that they don't want you to know. Partnerships don't work when half the team quits. Thank you so much for watching the show today. Please consider helping us reach and teach more and more people with this essential foundational information on the Constitution and how to defend it and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. There's nothing that helps us do this work more every single day than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual 5-year and lifetime options. You can also help us spread the word. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I don't want to belabor that. I'm very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today, and I'm so grateful for all of you who already are members. Thank you so much. If you want to help us spread the word with some free, easy peasy actions that you can take, smashing the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platforms, comments, subscribing, getting notifications, all those things can trigger algorithms of these platforms, and we reach more and more people every single time. I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope you learned something. Hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.